What can Robert Mueller add to the 448 pages of his written report?
We find out today as he takes questions before two congressional committees. The former special counsel spent almost 2 years examining Russia's interference in the election and confirmed it. He also examined possible obstruction of justice by the president. Mueller found numerous acts, but said a sitting president could not be indicted. Having said that, he explicitly appealed to Congress not to call him to testify.
Any testimony from this office would not go beyond our report. It contains our findings and analysis and the reasons for the decisions we made. We chose those words carefully, and the work speaks for itself. And the report is my testimony.
Or it was until today.
NPR Justice reporter Ryan Lucas has been covering this investigation from the beginning. Hey, Ryan.
Hello there.
So everybody wants something today, right? Let's run down the list. What do the Democrats want from Robert Mueller?
Well, Democrats have been angling for this day for a very long time. They were actually yesterday holding a mock testimony with aides to prepare for it. So there's been a lot of buildup. But as of late, there's also been an attempt to kind of tamp down expectations as to what we would hear from Mueller. Mueller, of course, is famously straight-edged. He's made clear, as we heard, that he didn't want to testify, doesn't want to stray beyond what's in his report. Speaking to Democrats last night, they say that's okay. Remember, Mueller's final report, it's very long, it's dense, it's written by lawyers, it's not approachable for a lot of people, and it's not something that a lot of Americans have read. Democrats think that having Mueller speak in public, on TV, with clips that will run on loop, on cable, will reach a far greater number of Americans than his written report has to this point. They want to use their time to focus on several episodes, if possible, of obstruction of justice by the president. They also plan to dig in on contacts between Trump associates and Russians that are documented in the report, put a spotlight on the campaign's willingness to accept Russian help. They want to highlight those things, bring them to life for the American people.
Okay, so the Democrats hoping to get a lot out of today's testimony. What do Republicans want?
In many ways, for Republicans, the status quo is a good thing. They want to protect the president. They want to emphasize the fact that Mueller did not charge anyone for conspiring with Russia. They're also expected to raise questions about the integrity, the even-handedness of the investigation itself. They've been pushing allegations of political bias on Mueller's team for months. We've heard that over and over from them. They've also alleged that the FBI committed surveillance abuses against the Trump campaign. Some of the president's most ardent supporters are on these committees, and they may go after Mueller on those exact issues.
So he's going to appear before two committees today, House Judiciary and House Intelligence. We're expecting about 5 hours of testimony in all. Are we going to hear Robert Mueller say anything new?
That's a good question. And frankly, it's pretty much up to Robert Mueller himself. He has made clear, as we said, doesn't want to be here, doesn't want to testify, doesn't want to say anything beyond what is in the report. The Justice Department, in fact, sent him a letter with guidance this week that his testimony should not go beyond what's in the report. That includes discussions about investigative steps or decisions that his team made, which is something that Democrats have expressed interest in. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, sent Mueller a letter yesterday lambasting the DOJ about this, said the administration was essentially trying to obstruct a legitimate congressional investigation, and he said it should have no impact on Mueller's testimony. It would be a major accomplishment for either side to get something new out of Mueller, but again, neither side is really banking on that.
And just really quickly, Mueller did something interesting here. He asked for one of his top aides to sit next to him today and assist him. What's the significance there?
Right. That top aide is Aaron Zebley. He will be at the hearings today. Caused a lot of stir on the Hill, but what this may boil down to is essentially big, sprawling investigation. Mueller may need some help with the details.
Okay. NPR Justice reporter Ryan Lucas. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
And you can follow more special coverage of the Mueller hearing on NPR member stations, npr.org, and later today on All Things Considered. Okay, the Justice Department says it is investigating the power of some big tech companies.
It's an antitrust investigation. In announcing this probe, federal prosecutors did not name names, but they seem to be talking about the likes of Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Google, the really big ones. Congress has already been questioning those companies over privacy protections, allegations of bias, and the spread of false information.
NPR tech correspondent Aarti Shahani is on the line from Silicon Valley. Hey, Aarti.
Hi.
All right, so let's start with this antitrust review. That was the DOJ's words. What does it mean? What are they looking into?
So the key issue is whether these companies we all know and use are stifling competition. There's a school of thought that says if a product is free, that's fantastic for consumers. You can't beat free. Who cares if its maker is a monopoly? But that is coming under attack with this other school, that free isn't really free. In the case of Facebook or Google, the user who provides the data has been turned into the unwitting product. In the case of Amazon, small businesses that sell on the platform have to pay to play, advertise to be seen, and then their data gets turned into corporate intelligence for Amazon to drive them out of business. Apple may be giving its developers, who are the heart and soul of the App Store, a raw deal. So the Justice Department is going to look into whether small businesses, would-be startups, and consumers are getting harmed, and also how these companies got to be so big. Were laws violated along the way?
So have any of the companies said anything about this?
In response to NPR's inquiry, Google pointed to its testimony in Congress last week. Google's head of economic policy made the case that his company creates lots of opportunity for others. Its advertising tools have helped small businesses grow, and its employees have gone on to build more than 2,000 startups. In the case of Amazon and Apple, they didn't immediately respond to NPR's request, but Apple made the case that its App Store is safe and trusted for customers and also great for developers. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos has pointed out that other businesses are selling more to customers on his site than Amazon is. Facebook declined to comment, though they have also said before they face vigorous competition from other platforms. I would note at two separate hearings also last week, one of Facebook's leaders was making the case that regulators should let the company make its own digital currency. So while the government's worried about tech giants being too big, Facebook is trying to get way bigger.
Facebook's Libra,
Yes.
actually. All right. So
There you
now
go.
that this review is underway, what's like the next step? What happens next?
This isn't a quick turnaround. There's no clear timeline on how long the Justice Department will take. And two examples from the past point to wildly different outcomes. AT&T, which started with a DOJ review, was formally broken up. Microsoft, also brought into court and lost, ultimately was not broken up. So what we know for sure is that big tech will stay a major political issue throughout the coming months.
NPR's Arthi Shahani. We'll be talking to you later today. Thanks again, Arthi.
Thank you.
All right, we have an update now on a Pennsylvania school district that threatened families over unpaid student lunch debt.
It's the Wyoming Valley West School District outside of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Dozens of parents there owed the school a total of $22,000 for lunches. Officials threatened to put kids in foster care if their parents did not pay. Since NPR first reported the school's debt collection efforts, several donors have stepped forward to settle the cafeteria tab, but that has not ended the story.
NPR reporter Bobby Allen has been chasing this story down. Hey, Bobby.
Hey.
So someone offered to pay the debt for the kids. Who was it?
So 5 people actually stepped forward to clear this tab, and one of them was a prominent media figure who wants to remain anonymous,
Fair enough.
but, was so outraged by this story that tried to reach out to these school officials and, get rid of this delinquent meal debt, but county officials are not responding.
They're not responding. So people have come forward and said, we'll pay the kids' debt. And the school's just got nothing to say about that?
Yeah, it's the really weird part. A lot of people, when they first heard that, there were donors out there who are willing to get rid of this school debt, that would be the end of the story. But now we know that, no, that's not the end of the story. And in fact, besides the prominent media figure who I just mentioned, who wants to take care of this debt anonymously, there's another person who tried to intervene who actually had the same exact experience. It's this guy, Todd Carmichael, and he's the chief executive of the coffee roasting company La Colombe. They're based in Philadelphia. And he told me about growing up poor and being raised, with 3 siblings by a single mother outside of Spokane, Washington. And he said, being shamed about not having enough money to pay for a meal is something he actually experienced as a kid himself, and threatening to take parents away threatening to take kids away from their parents is just something that made him really, really angry.
You're threatening people who are struggling with taking their children because they can't pay for the hot lunch. This kind of drives against everything that I believe is decent and good and American and friendly and neighborly and who we are as a people.
I mean, I know you've been talking to school officials. Do you have any idea why they're just blowing off these donors?
It's really hard to say because officials have gone into bunker mode. I mean, I have contacted them 7, 8 times over the past day, and they're just not getting back to me. Carmichael and the other donors say they're just mystified about this whole situation. I mean, the district, Wyoming Valley West, which is in the Poconos area, is one of the poorest in Pennsylvania. So you'd think officials there would be receptive to donations worth tens of thousands of dollars, right? But Carmichael has his own theory about what's really going on here. He says this really isn't about money at all. He thinks it's about teaching people who are struggling some kind of moral lesson, no matter what the consequences are.
Oh, that is interesting. All right, just quickly, are parents still getting the threatening letters, or have they stopped coming?
No, county officials sent a cease and desist letter and said the school can no longer use this threatening language. The school did say that they will not do that anymore. And what's interesting is, though this ignited a national firestorm, when I did have a chance to talk to the school officials, they said many locals there actually supported the letter.
NPR's Bobby Allen. Bobby, thanks so much.
Hey, thank you.
He came, he testified, so what now?
Former special counsel Robert Mueller took questions from Congress about his investigation into Russian interference during the 2016 election and about whether President Trump obstructed justice. For the most part yesterday, Mueller's answers were short and direct. Again and again, he referred lawmakers to the 448-page report that his office issued earlier this year. And still, members of Congress pushed him to say what was in that report out loud. Here's the Democratic chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
So that was the first hearing. The second was before the House Intelligence Committee and focused specifically on Russian interference. Republican Will Hurd of Texas asked Mueller this.
In your investigation, did you think that this was a single attempt by the Russians to get involved in our election, or did you find evidence to suggest they'll try to do this again?
No, it wasn't a single attempt. They're doing it as we sit here. And they expect to do it during the next campaign.
Okay, so what did we learn from all this? What does it change? We're going to ask NPR Justice reporter Ryan Lucas and NPR political reporter Tim Mack. They are both in our studios this morning. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Ryan, I want to start with you. You were paying special attention to the judiciary hearing, which focused on the issue of obstruction. We heard that clip from Chairman Nadler there. What did Democrats want from this hearing?
Well, what they wanted to do was zero in on a handful of episodes in Mueller's report of the president trying to impede the investigation. Now, those include the president directing his then White House counsel, Don McGahn, to fire Mueller, the president directing McGahn to then deny that he had been directed to fire Mueller. Democrats knew that a lot of Americans didn't read Mueller's report, so what they wanted to do with this first hearing and the question of obstruction of justice was highlight these specific episodes and bring them to life for the American public.
But Robert Mueller wasn't having it. I mean, he wouldn't even read out loud his own report. So it ended up being this kind of awkward situation where the lawmakers themselves are forced to read it and then ask, was that right?
Right. He was not a chatty witness.
No.
No one would accuse Mueller of that. He was definitely brief in his responses that forced Democrats, as you said, to read from the report themselves. Democrats did get one big point on the record from Mueller, though, in that sort of exchange that we heard with Nadler that directly contradicts the mantra that we've heard from Trump of, I was totally exonerated. Hearing Mueller say this was not a total exoneration was something that Democrats wanted to get. Interestingly enough, actually, one exchange that has caught the eye of a lot of people came with a Republican. That's Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
Now, Mueller's report basically says as much, that if a president commits a crime, he can be charged once he has left office.
Right. And it's not specific. He wasn't saying President Trump. There is evidence enough to charge President Trump with this crime when he leaves office. He was talking generally. Yeah. All right. So what about other Republicans? I mean, we just mentioned Ken Buck, but more holistically, what was the Republican approach?
By and large, what they try to do is what they did throughout the investigation. Undermine it, sow doubt about the integrity of the investigation and the investigators. Raised the same sort of allegations that we've heard for months, that Mueller's team was politically biased, that it was a witch hunt out to bring down Trump. Mueller knocked both of those down. He said political affiliations played zero role in his hiring decisions. He said he wanted people who could get the job done quickly and with integrity, and he flatly denied that this was a witch hunt in any way.
All right, Tim Mack, let's turn this over to you. So the second hearing was with the House Intelligence Committee. Mueller made it really clear in his report that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election. That has been established firmly. Did we learn anything new about that yesterday?
So Mueller was clear on how pressing an issue this was for U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies. As we heard a little bit earlier, he said that Russians were engaged in disinformation right now as we sit here. But he also added that other foreign actors are kind of spinning up their own operations and getting involved in this space. Disinformation is a low-cost method to spread a lot of mayhem in the American democratic process, and he says he fully expects the Russian government to take part in election interference again in 2020.
In fact, he said they're doing it right now as we sit here, right? So members of Congress, what did they say about what Mueller had to say about election security?
So there's been a big push by Senate Democrats in recent days, and again after Mueller's testimony, to push Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to allow votes on bipartisan election security legislation. As we've reported a lot about here on NPR, election security is more than just ballot security, right? So lawmakers have proposed things like mandatory disclosures of foreign political ad buyers, required reporting if a foreign actors offer political information to a campaign, and automatic sanctions against any country that's determined to interfere with a U.S. election. But so far, McConnell has said that these measures are not necessary.
Why, Tim? I mean, what's the Republican resistance to something that both parties say, yes, no, Russia absolutely should not interfere in American elections?
Well, McConnell in particular has pointed to the 2018 midterms and said, we've stepped up our game since 2016. Law enforcement agencies and the intelligence community have the tools currently that they need to secure our elections. It's not necessary to take additional legislative measures.
So what else did you hear that struck you in the testimony, especially from Republicans yesterday on this issue?
Well, Republicans reiterated that Mueller didn't find sufficient evidence to charge a conspiracy between members of the Trump campaign and Russia. Here's what House Intelligence Committee Ranking Member Devin Nunes had to say about that.
The Democrats have argued for nearly 3 years that evidence of collusion is hidden just around the corner. Like the Loch Ness Monster, they insist it's there, even if no one can find it.
So Republicans even spent some time questioning the link between the Russian government and the Russian troll farms that spread disinformation during the 2016 campaign, even though that's been a well-established fact affirmed by the intelligence community and members of the Trump administration.
So it was notable, Robert Mueller didn't even say the word impeachment, but it was so huge, it was looming over everything yesterday. Did his testimony move that needle at all?
Well, I have to say that Democrats probably were hoping for the Mueller testimony to land with more impact than it did yesterday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave a press conference after Mueller's testimony, said there's still work to do before she's interested in going down the impeachment path, but the investigations on the Hill will continue. In fact, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler says he's going to go to court today to enforce subpoenas to obtain McGahn's testimony and obtain the Mueller grand jury materials.
So it's over, yet it goes on.
It continues.
Is what you're telling me. NPR's Tim Mack and Ryan Lucas. Thanks, you guys. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And we've got some breaking news from overnight. After 12 days of protests, the governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló, has resigned.
That's right. Those demonstrations started after some really offensive texts that the governor exchanged with members of his inner circle were made public. Earlier this week, Rosselló said he was going to stay in office, but that he wouldn't seek re-election. That was not enough. The protests kept going. And then last night, in a video statement on Facebook, the governor finally said, okay, enough.
El reclamo ha sido contundente y lo he recibido con el más alto grado de humildad.
He said the call has been resounding and I have received it with the highest degree of humility.
NPR's David Welna is in San Juan covering all this. So, David, what else was in that statement from Rosselló?
Well, Rachel, he said he had fully intended to serve out the 2 years that remain of his term. In fact, just a few days ago, he said he would do so, but not seek re-election. But Now he saw that all he's accomplished so far, he said, could be damaged if he remained in office. He did not mention the fact that Puerto Rico's Congress was planning to begin impeachment proceedings against him this afternoon if he did not resign, or that he'd been served with a search warrant this week and that many of his cabinet members, as well as his chief of staff, had already stepped down. As for just when the governor will actually leave, he said it will be next Friday, August 2nd, and it's not clear how that delay is going to go over with all the people demanding that he leave office immediately.
It was really remarkable, these protests and demonstrations. It didn't really have a leader, right? It was a really grassroots kind of movement. What's been the reaction among demonstrators?
Well, they were victorious last night, and they rejoiced when the governor confirmed what had been rumored all day long yesterday, that he had had a change of heart and had decided to step down. There was a lot of anxiety earlier in the evening when Rosselló failed to make a promised announcement late in the afternoon, and things looked like they could get nasty when squads of police in full riot gear appeared outside the fortress, as the governor's palace is known. But when it became official he's leaving, people danced in the street and people honked car horns throughout the night. They're still honking them, celebrating what really was a grassroots-driven uprising that, as you said, had no clear leaders and no party affiliation either. This is the first time in modern Puerto Rico history that a governor has resigned, and had he stayed, it would have been the first impeachment undertaken by the island's Congress. Things have been pretty tough here, with tight austerity measures imposed to qualify for disaster assistance promised by the U.S. Congress to help rebuild from Hurricane Maria. And it just infuriated people to see their governor joking with his pals and insulting people in these online private chats that got leaked.
Right. So speaking of no clear leader, I mean, things are up in the air, right, when it comes to who's going to succeed him?
Yes, because Puerto Rico has no lieutenant governor, and the Secretary of the Interior is the next in line to replace Rosselló. But that secretary resigned after those chats were leaked, and he has not been replaced. So the next in line is the Secretary of Justice, Wanda Vasquez, and it would appear she'd fill this vacancy. But she's widely seen here as tainted by her association with the governor and could lack the legitimacy needed to do this job. People here are still planning to go ahead with street demonstrations this morning, with more protests planned over the next few days. They'll be celebrating Rosselló's resignation, but they're likely going to be demanding that someone else replace him.
All right, NPR's David Welna reporting in San Juan. The governor there in Puerto Rico has announced his resignation. David, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
This country still has a lot of work to do to secure its elections from foreign interference.
That's the main takeaway from a new report out of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The report details Russia's targeting of U.S. election systems in the 2016 presidential campaign. Efforts that targeted all 50 U.S. states. It was released just a day after former special counsel Robert Mueller testified that Russia continues to work to interfere in U.S. elections even right now. Here's what Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said on the Senate floor Thursday.
Mueller's testimony should be a wake-up call to every American, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, that the integrity of our elections is at stake.
NPR's Pam Fessler has been looking into this new report. Pam, thanks for coming in.
Hi.
So Russian interference in the 2016 elections is something we've been talking about for a couple of years now. Does this report add anything to what we already knew?
Well, we knew most of the specifics already, but what this really drives home by bringing it all together is just how extensive this Russian effort was to undermine our elections. They just had this wide-ranging campaign to just try to hack into these systems and also just to see how vulnerable they were. There only seemed to be about 2 successful intrusions involving an Illinois voter registration database and emails in some Florida counties. But that said, the committee said there's no evidence that any votes were changed or that any records were altered. But it's kind of interesting how they characterize it. They characterize this as almost a reconnaissance effort, that they were, quote, one official said, trying to establish a presence so you could come back later and actually execute an operation, which is one reason they're so concerned about the future.
Come back later. Those are worrying words. Is it any clearer after this report what the Russians actually want to do to the United States?
Well, I think it's not necessarily so much changing getting actual votes, but it's sowing discord and confusion, possibly on Election Day. A lot of these intrusions or efforts to hack involve state election websites, voter registration databases, the kind of things that people rely on information for on Election Day. All I had to do is maybe change some of the records or, where you're supposed to go on Election Day to vote, and that could just, cause a lot of chaos on Election Day.
So a ton at stake. States and the federal government have been doing some things to keep this from happening again. What does the report say about their efforts?
Well, first it said that back in 2016, things were really bad,
Okay.
that they did not coordinate, they did not communicate very much, but that things have gotten a lot better. There's a lot of coordination with federal and state officials sharing intelligence, trying to beef up cybersecurity. But basically the committee says that more needs to be done.
More needs to be done, but what's being done is working. It sounds like some room for optimism.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking all the time now about how to tighten up security and, as I say, sharing intelligence. But one of the things that the committee said was that, a lot more needs to be done as far as buying new equipment, having paper-based voting machines that can be audited and where the votes can be verified. Congress has approved money for this, but said that maybe more money is going to be needed.
More money might be needed, and yet one of the problems is it's been hard getting that money to the states, right?
Exactly. And, there's a number of pieces of legislation to try and tighten security that have passed in the House, but it's being stalled in the Senate because there's some reluctance, especially by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who says he doesn't think that the federal government should be too intrusive as far as controlling elections, and that we saw in 2018 there weren't that many problems, and he thinks that a lot has already been done and we don't need to do as much.
It'll be interesting to see if this report changes any minds on that. NPR's Pam Fessler. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks.
All right. No inmate on federal death row has been executed for 16 years. That is going to change soon.
The Attorney General, William Barr, announced that the Department of Justice is going to resume capital punishment, and he has ordered the first federal executions since 2003. 5 inmates found guilty of murder have been scheduled for execution beginning in December.
NPR's Cheryl Corley has been following this story. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning.
So why did Attorney General Barr move to reinstate the federal death penalty now after all these years?
Well, we can only go by his statement, and he said that he was upholding the rule of law. And he says the Justice Department owes it to the victims and their families to move on these death sentences, especially since the inmates selected have all exhausted all their efforts for appeals of their sentences. It's also no secret that President Trump favors the death penalty and has called for increasing the use of it. And the Trump administration has really just been laying the groundwork for executions to resume.
Could anything stand in the way of this move?
Sure. There are already folks calling for legal challenges. There will be lots of roadblocks. The ACLU says that it will take legal action. The ACLU also says usually any new protocol like this gets reviewed by the courts, by defendants' attorneys, by the public, and that could all take much more time than the time frame the Justice Department has set for these executions to actually begin.
Right, beginning in December, and we know that there are 5 people who have been identified. What do we know about those 5 people? Who are they?
Well, they are people that the Attorney General has said are people who tortured and raped society's most vulnerable, children and the elderly. We know one man killed a family of 3, including an 8-year-old girl. Another stabbed a 63-year-old grandmother and her 9-year-old grandchildren. And there are several other just really awful killings that involving both children and elderly people.
Okay, so people who have committed some heinous crimes. Cheryl, why have there not been any federal executions over the past 16 years? Why was this? Was this a moratorium, a hiatus? What happened?
Well, federal executions are done by lethal injection, and there's been a lot of problems associated with with how they were done in the past. There's a 3-drug cocktail used over the years. There's been court battles over it, difficulty in obtaining at least one of the drugs. Some pharmaceutical companies didn't want their drugs used for executions, botched executions. And now the DOJ says it will follow the protocol used in some of the states that are using just one drug.
I see. So there have been logistical challenges. Okay. NPR's Cheryl Corley. Thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
Moscow is having a summer of protests in the street.
Right. So first people turned out in support of this investigative journalist who was arrested on manufactured drug charges. And now protesters are out demanding that opposition political candidates be allowed on the ballot in upcoming city council elections. Last weekend, there were these huge anti-government rallies in downtown Moscow, the biggest in years, and another protest is planned for Saturday.
NPR's Lucian Kim is in Moscow. Hey, Lucian.
Good morning.
So how, Lucian, did a city council election galvanize such massive protests?
The opposition is angry because they followed all the rules, they collected the several thousand signatures needed to register each of their candidates, and the election commission came back to them and said there were too many irregularities, sorry, you can't run. The opposition in Russia right now is a new strategy. They're focusing on local elections as a way to get political experience and popularity. Some people say it was a huge mistake by the city not to let them run, but that's not how Vladimir Putin's system works. From the logic of the Kremlin, the authorities had to bar those candidates because even allowing them to run would have given them legitimacy and been an admission that they even exist.
So you mentioned that even though these are city council elections, Vladimir Putin is very deeply involved. I wonder, when you look out and you see these crowds and you see people taking the risk, how politically dangerous are these protests for Putin? Do they really threaten him?
Well, Putin's supporters will always remind you that a few hundred or even a few thousand people protesting in a huge metropolis like Moscow is insignificant. But if the opposition is really so marginal, then why did the police put opposition leader Alexei Navalny in jail this week? Or why did they conduct nighttime searches at the homes of some of those opposition candidates? Navalny spoke to reporters at last weekend's rally. This is what he told us.
Я много раз писал и говорил, что единственное, что понимает эта власть, это людей, которые находятся на улице.
So what he's saying is that the only thing that the government understands is people out on the street. And it's true. Civic activists here in Russia have scored several victories this year via protests. They stopped a controversial construction project in one city and had those charges dropped against an investigative journalist here in Moscow back in June. Of course, these protests aren't going to overthrow the government, but they are certainly an indicator of how dissatisfied people are in Moscow, where the Kremlin has really invested billions of dollars exactly to keep people happy.
Okay, so tomorrow you are expecting big crowds in the city again. What are you going to be looking at specifically?
Well, tomorrow's protest has not been authorized, which automatically raises the stakes for participants. At last weekend's rally, which was authorized, I asked one woman, she identifies herself as a regular Moscow housewife, if she'd be going to tomorrow's protest, and she said she was uncertain. People are angry, but they're also scared. But at the same time, the government has to be careful. If they show too much force, it could really backfire and bring out even more people onto the street.
So worth noting that in a summer of protests, these protests are still dangerous for the people participating in them. NPR's Lucian Kim in Moscow. Lucian, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
The Gilroy Garlic Festival is this annual tradition in Northern California that brings in thousands of people every year. There's a lot of food, there's music. It's the kind of summer event that is replayed in American towns across the country this time of year. This year, though, the festival in Gilroy turned into a crime scene.
Yeah, police say they responded quickly to reports of gunfire on Sunday. Here is Gilroy Police Chief Scott Smithy.
It's just incredibly sad and disheartening that an event that does so much good for our community has to suffer from a tragedy like this.
Police say the unidentified gunman killed 3 people and injured at least 15, and then police shot and killed the gunman.
Reporter Erica Mahoney of member station KAZU is covering the story and joins us now. So, Erica, this festival is huge, right? I used to live in Northern California. This is a big deal every year. Garlic is a big crop in Gilroy, and so they make a big party out of it. Tons of families come. I mean, what can you tell us about what we know at this point?
So what we know is that the shooting began at 5:41 p.m. local time here on the third and final day of the Garlic Festival, which is right in Northern California, just 80 miles south of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And police say that they responded quickly to the reports of gunfire. One suspect had some sort of rifle. He was shot and killed shortly after being engaged by an officer, according to the police chief. A second suspect, a possible accomplice, was not apprehended, and police say they are unaware of what role that second person played. So at this point, they are still asking witnesses for information and cell phone video, and they've even set up a hotline for people to call.
I understand, you were in Gilroy. You went to this reunification center for people. These are tents, essentially, are set up after something like this happens, where people can get information about loved ones or anyone missing, right?
Yeah, it was a parking lot at a nearby college, Gavilan College. And actually it was set up by the festival organizers initially as a place where the attendees could hop on buses and be shuttled back and forth. So then after the shooting happened, it became that place where families and people attending the festival could find one another, get some information, but it was very chaotic. There wasn't a lot of information going around. I did speak with a volunteer. She's been volunteering at the festival for 18 years, Marcia Struzik. She just said, she felt sick to her stomach.
I'm sure. So, I mean, as we noted, this is the kind of festival that happens all across America during the summer. Food, and it's just a huge celebration. At the same time, it's harrowing to go into some kind of really populated event these days. What do we know about the security setup for this?
Well, of course, the police chief said he never wanted to have a press conference like this. Gilroy is just south of Silicon Valley, so in recent years it's become a bedroom community for that area. But of course it has deep agricultural roots. It's considered the garlic capital of the world. And, the shooting happened at the annual Garlic Festival, which has been going on since 1979.
Right.
So 100,000 people come here for this 3-day celebration, very family-friendly. But, that's not to say there wasn't security. In fact, the chief of police said there was a metal detector and bags were inspected as well.
All right. Erica Mahoney of member station KAZU covering this story. Thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. One of the last members of President Trump's original national security team, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, is out.
The president made that personnel announcement on Twitter, as he often does. He said Dan Coats will be leaving his post next month. The president says he plans to nominate John Ratcliffe, a Republican member of Congress from Texas, and a Trump defender. Here is Ratcliffe on Fox News Sunday criticizing Democrats over Robert Mueller's congressional testimony.
They overplayed their hand, and they did it in front of the American people on a national television audience, and it was just a train wreck of a week for the Democrats, and it was a great week for Donald Trump because of that.
We've got NPR national security correspondent Greg Myrie in studio this morning. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Rachel.
Why is this happening now?
Well, no specific reason, but the president and Dan Coats had a pretty rocky relationship throughout his tenure. And I think even more broadly, this is a president who's gone through almost all his original national security members: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisors, Homeland Security Directors.
We should say is an exceptional number of replacements to make, even though we're now at the end of his first term.
It is, absolutely.
You mentioned the tension between these two, Coats and Trump. Can you give us some of the highlights? What were the moments?
I think when Trump and Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, had a summit last summer, at a press conference afterward, Trump questioned whether Russia interfered with the election. And Coats took this highly unusual step of issuing a very blunt statement saying the consensus of the intelligence community is that Russia interfered and they're still doing it, and we're not going to stop presenting this unvarnished truth. So that really stood out. But just this last January, Coates went on and testified on Capitol Hill after the president had said North Korea's nuclear program was no longer a threat and that the Islamic State had been defeated. And Coates contradicted him very publicly. So you didn't hear a lot from Coates, but when you did, it seemed to be shooting down something the president had recently said.
DNI is a tough job, right? You are theoretically, this is a job you're overseeing all the other intelligence agencies. It was created after 9/11. What's his legacy, Dan Coates?
Right. So, it is this sort of funny position where you're overseeing 16 other intelligence agencies. But I think one thing he did do was shift the emphasis, or was part of this community-wide effort. For almost 2 decades, the focus has been on terror groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Coates has really stressed the traditional big state rivalry. He called them the Big Four: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and said the U.S. should be placing greater concentration on that. The other thing was election security. And in fact, in one of his last acts, he appointed an election security czar, somebody who will oversee or coordinate all the government efforts heading into the 2020 balloting.
So Coates was also known as a guy who didn't really seek to politicize intelligence as the job of the DNI. Could that change with his successor, though, John Ratcliffe, who's been such a vocal defender of the president?
Well, that's been the concern. Again, early days. He still needs to be formally nominated and confirmed. But yes, he's seen as a highly partisan figure in his defense of Trump and his criticism of the Mueller report. Also, he's in his third term. He's only been in Washington about 4 or 5 years at this point. He has experience as a prosecutor in terrorism cases, but he has not worked in the intelligence community. So that's to win the trust of the intelligence community will take some time.
Okay, so we will look forward to those confirmation hearings. NPR's Greg Myrie, thanks.
Thanks, Rachel.
A disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. That is a direct quote. It is what President Trump called the District of Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings.
The district includes a good part of Baltimore, which is a majority black city. The president also said, quote, "No human being would want to live there," although many people do want to live there, including City Council President Brandon Scott.
The President of the United States, the leader of the free world, who is the person who is in the best position of any human being on the planet to help Baltimoreans who need help, instead of doing so, is using his office to beat down an American city.
And making lots of news with a tweet or two. His tweets echoed his previous attacks on 4 Democratic members of Congress of color.
NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez is in studio. Hi, Franco.
Hi.
What prompted this attack by the president?
Well, the first tweets came on Saturday after a very unflattering segment on Fox News about Representative Cummings and his district. Should note that Cummings is also chair of the House Oversight Committee, which has been investigating Trump. The committee actually recently sought the personal emails and texts of Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner. He's been lashing out in a way with these tweets, as you just played. Democrats are calling the troops racist. So are many Baltimore residents, as we heard. But Trump has shown very little interest in turning down the temperature. He has tweeted 14 times, and the message very explicitly is, focus on your district and not on me.
So what is Congressman Cummings saying about this?
Well, he's saying, he tweeted about this. He said in a tweet, "Mr. President, I go home to my district daily. Each morning I wake up and I go and fight for my neighbors." He went on to say it's his constitutional duty to conduct oversight of the executive branch.
Often when the president tweets something like this, especially attacks on individual lawmakers or cities, it makes things difficult for Republicans. Have we heard any response from the GOP?
We have not heard much yet. Like when Trump attacked the 4 minority congresswomen just a few weeks ago, the majority of Republican leaders have kept quiet. Even those that have spoken out have been very tempered. Representative Will Hurd, one Republican from Texas, he's the only African-American Republican in the House of Representatives. He wouldn't explicitly condemn Trump's attacks. He did when Trump attacked the 4 congresswomen. But this time, Hurd said this is different. He just said he wouldn't tweet that way. Mick Mulvaney, Trump's chief of staff, was asked about this on CBS, asked whether he understood why people perceive the president's comments as racist.
I understand why, but that doesn't mean that it's racist. The president is pushing back against what he sees as wrong. It's how he's done in the past, and he'll continue to do in the future.
And we've heard this line very similarly. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders has said this a lot.
What does it say about how the president sees his path to victory in 2020?
Well, the president launched a campaign that was based in part on racial divisions and stoking tensions by attacking immigrants from Mexico. We have seen this again and again. It's something that I'm not going to say it's a master strategy of President Trump, but it is something that he has shown instinct for.
NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez. Franco, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Democratic presidential primary voters face at least two big questions. One is who they think can win in 2020. Another is what each candidate would do if elected.
And tonight, the country sees a range of possible choices here. This debate, like the last one, features 20 candidates who will be divided across 2 nights. And by chance, the first night in Detroit features all white candidates. But there is some diversity of ideas. 2 of the more progressive candidates are at center stage, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Toward the edges are more moderate figures like Colorado's John Hickenlooper.
NPR lead political editor Domenico Montanaro will be in Detroit tonight. Domenico, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
How clear is it at this early stage what the party will stand for next fall?
Well, in this debate one, certainly you have, when you look at that center stage, which is organized by polling and the people who are on top in the polls, you've got a socialist or a Democratic socialist in Bernie Sanders and someone who wants to make pretty radical economic reforms in Elizabeth Warren. And the two of them have not shown that they really want to be going after each other very much. You noted the fact that this is going to be an all-white stage. And even though it's the most diverse in presidential history, all the candidates of color are on night 2. And it's going to be interesting to see how issues, for example, of race might come up.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to have an opportunity to find that out. Let me ask about those 2 central candidates. They might be questioned from the edges. You might hear a question from the likes of Tim Ryan or John Hickenlooper, who have a very different approach or say they have a very different approach to the economy and other issues. But what's the difference, if any, between those top 2 in tonight's group, Sanders and Warren?
Well, and these are 2 progressive heroes, and you've seen Elizabeth Warren gain on Senator Sanders in the polls. But when I talked to the Sanders campaign, and when our reporters have done so as well, the Sanders camp's pretty clear that Sanders is not going to go after Warren. He sees her as ally in implementing progressive change. But again, they are competing for the same job, and at some point they might have to draw distinctions if it comes down to the 2 of them. Sanders points to his friendship with her and working together. There was a funny moment on CNN when Sanders was asked a week ago to say something nice about her, and here was his response.
Senator Warren is a friend of mine, and I admire the fact that we have worked together over the years on a number of issues.
Anything specific?
Well, look, we have worked together on a number of issues, and she is a very good senator.
Okay, keeping it vague, but when you look at the things that they say that they would do if elected, are there some differences?
There are. He's not someone who likes to concede any ground, would rather talk about big issues than about feelings. But when you do dig inside some of the issues on them and just how far they would want to go in reshaping the country, Warren wants big structural change, but not socialism. She calls herself a capitalist. And on one area that hasn't been touched on much in this campaign, foreign policy, there are some big differences. Warren talks about how the defense industry, for example, should have a seat at the table but not own the table. Sanders, on the other hand, has long-time misgivings about American foreign policy, said that he would leverage aid, for example, recently against Israel, calling it an extreme right-wing government with many racist tendencies.
Let me ask one other thing. You mentioned race. You mentioned the lack of diversity by chance in tonight's group, but race is not just an issue for people of color. It's an issue for white people, and especially at this moment. Can you see ways that it would come up?
Well, it's certainly an opportunity for them to show unity against President Trump, because that has been something that has come up with this president. And remember, Pete Buttigieg has had to answer for his record in South Bend as mayor in debate one. It could be interesting to see if a question of that comes back up tonight.
Domenico, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Domenico Montanaro. Once it is fired, a bullet does not discriminate. And when a gunman fired many bullets in Gilroy, California, some killed children.
Yeah, victims of last weekend's mass shooting there included a 6-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. Gilroy's police chief Scott Smithy was speaking about the victims yesterday.
Anytime a life is lost, it's a tragedy. But when it's young people, it's even worse. And, it's very difficult.
That's the police chief yesterday. On This Morning, NPR's Layla Fadel is on the line. She's been in Gilroy. Layla, good morning.
Good morning.
What have you been seeing and hearing?
Well, last night, the last thing I did was attend a vigil where people gathered in the hundreds to share in their shock, in their pain, but also share in each other's strengths in the face of this tragedy. Leaders and community members vowed not to allow their town and this festival to be defined by violence. Here's Gilroy Mayor Roland Velasco.
There will be a day when we start to heal and start to move on with our lives. And the reason for that is because we cannot let the bastard that did this tear us down.
Now, this really hit close to home for people because this festival has been going on for some 40 years. Everybody volunteers in town. They go for music, for fun. And so there were a lot of what ifs. What if I hadn't run fast enough? What if I had been there in that moment? And a lot of the survivors that I spoke to who ran when they heard bullets were young, like the people killed.
Layla, I've got to ask you personally, you've covered a number of mass shootings, including the nation's worst mass shooting. And when I listened to the mayor's words there, they were appropriate, but they almost seem formulaic at this point, almost like a script, because we have witnessed so many mass shootings. What went through your mind as you listened to those words again?
Unfortunately, that's true. There is a sort of this tragic routine to some of these mass shootings, but there was an insistence last night that this is not normal. And even though a lot of the people I was speaking to were saying, I feel numb, I've seen this on TV and now it's happening here, there is still a lot of people saying, we can't let this be normal.
What is known about some of the victims?
Well, we're still learning. One was a man in his 20s. Two were children, as you mentioned, a 13-year-old girl named Kayla Salazar from San Jose, and another little boy, just 6 years old. We've seen his picture, Stephen Romero. He was killed, and his mother and grandmother were both shot and injured.
And what about the suspect, the one person who was killed barely less than a minute into the shooting?
Right. He was engaged by police less than a minute into the shooting. And the one thing that wasn't mentioned during this vigil was the shooter's name. People don't want to talk about him, to name him, to give him a platform. But they did identify him, the police, and he's a 19-year-old from Gilroy, bought his gun in neighboring Nevada, where gun laws are less restrictive than California. Police are still investigating what might have motivated him. And there is speculation that what might have driven the shooter was based on a post on Instagram. That still hasn't been confirmed. He referenced a white power manifesto from a 19th century author.
And of course, we'll mention it's early, and you learn more about these things as we go, and all facts are almost provisional at this point because it is early in the investigation. Layla, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Layla Fadel. Some other news now. Capital One is dealing with one of the largest ever data breaches to hit a major American bank.
That's right. The company is saying this breach affects more than 100 million people in the United States and also Canada. A hacker obtained customer names, addresses, credit scores, and in some cases, also Social Security and bank account numbers. Investigators arrested a Seattle woman who they say is behind this hack.
Before talking about this more, we'll note that Capital One has been an NPR sponsor. Washington Post reporter Devlin Barrett has been following the story. He's in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
This sounds like some pretty significant information that was stolen.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest hacks to ever hit a financial services firm. You're talking about 100 million accounts, 100 million individuals in the U.S., another 6 million in Canada. And what they got was the credit card applications. And there's a good side and a bad side to that. The good side is for most of those individuals, the Social Security numbers were obscured, so the hacker couldn't access that. But some were viewable and accessible.
Yeah, but when you say most of the individuals were protected, 100 million people, there must be millions who weren't protected, right?
Well, there's tens of thousands who weren't.
All right.
And there was also tens of thousands whose bank account numbers were exposed as a result of this hack.
Does this mean that whoever got this could potentially have used that information to get their own credit card in somebody else's name, fake somebody's identity, any number of things?
Certainly, it had a huge potential for exploitation in terms of identity theft. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, what is known about the suspect here?
So we know that she is a computer programmer, software engineer who had worked at a cloud computing company. And that seems to be one of the key technical issues here, that she was able to apply her expertise and understanding of how Capital One used cloud computing and basically found a weakness in a firewall and could access all this stuff.
Should we just explain for people, cloud computing means that Capital One is like shipping all of its data offsite. It's in data farms somewhere out on the internet, and this woman found a way into it.
Right. Like a lot of companies, you pay someone else to basically store your large amounts of data, and that is, profitable usually on both ends of that equation. The challenge, obviously, is that you're giving your sensitive data to someplace else. And so she seems to have figured out that there was a flaw in the firewall.
It seems unusual that the suspect in a hack like this is identified so directly and so quickly.
Yes. One of the strange quirks of this case is that, according to the FBI, she was uncovered because she was basically bragging in a chat group about what she had done, and one of the other people in that conversation alerted Capital One.
Wow. So if she had been more discreet, she might still be doing this?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you believe the allegations, one of the lessons here is do not brag about your crimes in online chats. That's a bad idea.
Okay, good to know. And maybe even don't do the crime would be another lesson. But if you're going to do the crime, might want to avoid bragging. Does Capital One have anything to say about all of this?
Yeah, so the CEO issued an apology when they announced this. They're, trying to work out credit monitoring and some other things to try and make their customers feel a little more secure about this. They really emphasize that, very few Social Security numbers out of the large mass of individuals affected were taken.
Okay. Devlin, thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
That's Devlin Barrett of The Washington Post.
When Democratic presidential candidates gathered for a debate last night, the location really meant a lot.
10 Democrats were on stage in a historic theater in Detroit, which is in Michigan, a swing state. One of 3 states that Democrats were really counting on that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and assured his election. A big question for Democrats is how to win back the likes of Michigan. And last night's 10 candidates, the first of 2 sets of 10, spent much time debating how far left to go on issues like health care. Let's hear 3 of the candidates now. The first is Montana Governor Steve Bullock, a centrist who notes that some of his rivals want to go much farther than Obamacare.
It used to be just Republicans who wanted to repeal and replace. Now many Democrats do as well.
If we embrace a far-left agenda, they're going to say we're a bunch of crazy socialists. If we embrace a conservative agenda, you know what they're going to do? They're going to say we're a bunch of crazy socialists. So let's just stand up for the right policy, go out there and defend it.
And I've heard some people here tonight, I almost wonder why you're Democrats. You seem to think there's something wrong about using the instruments of government to help people.
The candidates following Steve Bullock there are South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg and author Marianne Williamson.
NPR political correspondent Asma Khalid is in Detroit. She covered the debate last night. Hi, Asma.
Good morning.
First, how awesome is the Fox Theater? I had some of my wedding photos taken outside.
It's
gorgeous, right?
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful architecture.
Yeah, what a setting. Well, a lot happened there last night. I guess for the Democratic Party, there was no hiding from real divisions between progressives and moderates. How did that all emerge?
That's right. That was the overarching theme of the night. And I would say we saw it play out in terms of multiple public policy fronts, most notably healthcare and immigration. And, these are 2 issues that are going to animate the debate in a general election as well between Democrats and Republicans. One big applause line around this clash came from Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. It was in response to former Maryland Congressman John Delaney when he said that Democrats win when they run on, quote, real solutions, not impossible promises.
I don't understand why anybody goes to all the trouble of running for president of the United States just to talk about what we really can't do and shouldn't fight for.
David, there was a lot of pre-debate chatter about a potential clash between 2 progressive icons. That's Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. But they did not fight last night. In fact, they tag-teamed on progressive policies all night as they fended off attacks from some of the more moderate candidates.
Wow. I just think about some of the issues you were talking about. Another that comes to mind is climate change, which is something a lot of Democratic voters are passionate about. Did that emerge as an issue where there's some divisions?
David, I would say not surprisingly, to some degree, the Democrats were fairly in agreement on climate change. It is a top issue, when we look at polling consistently among Democratic voters. But the conversation last night really tried to focus and bring it back to jobs and how you address climate change in a really economically feasible way.
One of the really interesting dynamics going into last night was the lineup for last night and then tonight is a random draw by CNN. But all of the candidates on stage last night were white, right? And, President Trump has really put racial divisions front and center in this campaign recently. So how did an entire field of white candidates deal with issues of race and racism?
Well, also noteworthy to me, this conversation was happening in Detroit. And Democrats on the campaign trail talk a lot about how you win back the White House. Do you try to persuade centrist voters, or do you really energize the base, most notably African Americans? And I will say, given the conversation being in Detroit, we did not hear extensively about race, even, given the comments that Donald Trump has made in the last couple of weeks. The way that the moderators focused the conversation, I would say even the discussion around immigration, was largely through the lens of the concerns of white suburban voters, right? Is decriminalizing the border, are they going too far? It was not necessarily through the lens of some of the concerns that I hear from Latino voters. That being said, we have a far more diverse field tonight, and so I anticipate we will hear a lot more about racial justice, criminal justice issues.
Okay, so we heard that there were big divisions on some big issues. Let's talk about what some of those divisions are in a little more granular way. NPR political reporter Danielle Kurtzleben was up very late last night, but has come back in early this morning, as Asma did as well. Danielle, good morning.
Hey, Steve.
So what is the difference on health insurance between a centrist Democrat and a more progressive one?
Well, as it was framed last night, the difference was Medicare for all versus not Medicare for all. It was a very sort of blunt, black and white discussion that in which they sort of alluded a lot of the details. Maybe I'll highlight one memorable exchange between Senator Bernie Sanders and Ohio Representative Tim Ryan, where Sanders made his ownership of Medicare for all really clear.
Medicare for all is comprehensive. It covers all health care needs for senior citizens. It will finally include dental care, hearing aids, and eyeglasses.
But you don't know
Second
that.
of all.
You don't know that,
Second
Bernie.
of all.
We'll come to you in a second,
I do know,
Congressman.
and I wrote the damn bill.
Okay.
A spicier exchange of the night there. But yeah, I mean, listen, it's unsurprising that Medicare for all dominated, but it's still important to talk about because you had some real significant other policy differences on that stage, but they didn't really get to a lot of these policy differences because they spent a lot of time talking about Medicare for all. And one other really important thing that I want to bring up in response to your question about moderate versus progressive is that it's really notable to step back and realize that just 10 years ago, a public option couldn't get into Obamacare.
Sure.
And now public option is the moderate position.
That's the minimum. The minimum is the government is going to get into the health insurance business more directly, and the question is whether private insurers get to be in the field as well or whether they get knocked out.
Right.
There's also a question about trade and tariffs, which, of course, President Trump has made a big deal. How are Democrats positioning themselves on that issue?
It's really impossible to generalize because this is an area where you can have a really big rift among Democrats. I mean, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, of course, Trump has pulled America out of, it's a giant trade deal that would have been among 11 nations plus the U.S., now U.S. no longer. That's something that Obama negotiated. Last night, you had former Maryland Rep. John Delaney saying he supports it. Well, the two people at the center of the stage, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, were two of the most vocal opponents of that. Not only that, but Donald Trump was a vocal opponent of that. So if you got one of those two on the debate stage with Donald Trump, you can imagine that there would have to be some sort of nuanced discussion of, okay, you both oppose TPP. What exactly do you oppose about it, and how do you differ?
No rest for the weary. Another round tonight we'll all be covering. Asma, you're in Detroit. What are you looking for on night two?
Yeah, the main concern I would say for folks here, it would be Joe Biden. And that is a concern for him of how he fends off some attacks. He did not have a particularly strong night last time during the debates.
All right, NPR's Asma Khalid in Detroit and Danielle Kurtzleben in Washington, D.C. Thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All All right, so today the Federal Reserve might do something it has not done since the 2008 recession.
The Fed is expected to announce it is cutting interest rates. This is a bit unusual. Normally, when the economy has grown for years, as it has, we've got about a decade of economic growth, you would expect the Fed to be raising rates or holding them steady. Recently, though, Fed officials have said there are areas of concern in an overall strong economy. Lower interest rates would make it cheaper for Americans to do things like borrow on their credit cards or take out car loans.
NPR's Scott Horsley covers economics and, among other things, keeps a close eye on the Fed and joins us on the line this morning. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, David.
All right, so let's talk this through. The Fed raised rates as recently as December of last year, not so long ago. So what warning signs are Fed officials seeing that might make them go in the opposite direction now?
We're definitely seeing a slowdown in economic growth, both here in the U.S. and around the world. Just last Friday, we learned that the U.S. economy grew at an annual rate of only 2.1% in the spring. That's down from about 3.1% in the first 3 months of the year. We also learned that last year's economic growth was actually slower than initially reported. At the same time, we're seeing slowing growth overseas, partly as a result of rising trade tensions. And inflation, which is often sort of the boogeyman for the Fed, is safely trussed up under the bed. So there's no signal of runaway price hikes. What that means is the Fed is ready to goose the economy in an effort to keep this decade-old expansion going a little longer. The Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has noted that it's only recently that a lot of Americans have begun to enjoy the fruits of that expansion. So if the old joke about the Fed is they take away the punch bowl just as the party's getting started, Powell and his colleagues seem to feel like, there are a lot of thirsty people who've been waiting in line for the punch. Let's bring out some more punch.
Well, lower interest rates, as Steve said, can make things cheaper for Americans to do stuff. So, how do consumers in general react to a decision like this?
Yeah, it could mean cheaper credit card rates. It could mean cheaper car loans. But here's the thing, David. Consumer spending is actually already pretty strong. It's not a lack of consumer spending that's slowing the economy. Instead, what we have seen is a drop in things like business investment. And that may or may not respond to such a modest reduction in what are already, very low interest rates.
Could it actually have a negative impact? What do some economists see as a negative impact of cutting rates?
It could mean lower interest rates on savings accounts and CDs. So it's not so good for people who actually have money in the bank. Of course, a lot of big banks are already paying next to nothing on savings accounts. But there are some attractive offers out there. I was looking at some internet banks that were paying north of 2% on savings. And, even if that were to go down by, say, a quarter percentage point, that would still be outpacing inflation.
Scott, remind me about President Trump's role here. He's done things that other presidents have not done in terms of his open and very passionate criticism of the Fed. How does that all potentially fit into this?
He has been loudly jawboning the Fed to cut rates in a big way. He was complaining just yesterday that both the economy and the stock market would be higher still had the Fed not raised interest rates on 4 separate occasions last year. As you say, a lot of presidents in the past have complained quietly and privately about the Fed's moves, but President Trump has been very vocal. No. Now, the Fed insists they are going to be guided by economic signals, not political pressure. But that said, Trump's own trade policies have certainly contributed to slowing economic growth. And that, in turn, is prompting the Fed to make these moves. So indirectly, the president's having an influence, even if it's not for the reasons he'd like.
All right, Scott, thanks so much for explaining all this. We always appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's NPR's Scott Horsley.